Without further ado, let me introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Joseph Ross. So Joseph Ross is a professor of medicine and of public health at the Yale School of Medicine. He's also the associate physician of the Center for Outcome Research and Evaluation at Yale New Haven Health System and the co-director of the National Clinical Scholars Program at Yale. With expertise in health services and outcome research examines the use and delivery of higher quality care, the translation of clinical research into practice, and addresses issues related to pharmaceutical and medical device regulation. Also, his research also develops or addresses evidence development, post-marketing surveillance, and medical product adoption. So Dr. Ross co-directs the Yale Mayo Clinic Center for Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation and the Yale Open Data Access Project. So he has an amazing number of 600 articles published in peer-reviewed journals and is deputy editor at JAMA, and is going to talk to us today about FDA regulatory review. And thank you for being here. I apologize for any technical glitches, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen, and it's a pleasure to be here. Like I have often said, no good deed goes unpunished. I had asked Ken Bukvar to review a paper that I was handling at JAMA, and he quickly turned around and asked me to come and speak at the Prescribing Research Network, which I was delighted to do. And he did a very excellent review for me. So I'm going to talk about FDA regulatory review and its implications for evidence-based prescribing. Let me just get my slides moving. Just in terms of potential conflicts of interest, here's the funding. I just wanted to disclose, Jen mentioned some of the projects I lead. All of it is through research grant funding through Yale from the FDA for the Yale Mayo Clinic Center of Excellence and Regulatory Science and Innovation of the CIRSE program. The FDA and MDIC support the NEST program. Johnson & Johnson and formerly Medtronic support the Yale Open Data Access Project. And I also get funds from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation or Arnold Ventures. The outline for today, if we have time to get through it all, I'm going to provide a brief history of the FDA and prescription drug oversight. I think it's actually kind of interesting for folks who haven't heard this before to think about the policies that guide the the evidence, the drugs that we are both prescribing and thinking about deprescribing. And that will include a review of the evidentiary standards to secure FDA approval for new drugs, and I'm going to discuss the implications for evidence-based prescribing. And I do this in part, I think a lot of people think, as clinicians and investigators, our focus typically is on medication use, safety, and effectiveness, as opposed to the role FDA's policies play in guiding what evidence is available to inform practice. And that's been a niche that I have been carving out and focusing on over the past decade of work. Just some background on the FDA, just very, very briefly. The agency actually got its start through legislation way back in 1906 with the passage of the Federal Food and Drugs Act. And the basis of the law actually rested on the regulation of product labeling rather than pre-market approval. So essentially what it did is it prohibited interstate commerce in misbranded food, drink, and drugs. So it really had little to do with safety or effectiveness. It just had to do with making consumers aware of what they were actually about to use. And it included information like, whether alcohol or morphine or cocaine was in the product that they were buying at the local, grocery store. The authorities of the agency were, greatly expanded in 1938 with the passage of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which now required proof of safety before a drug was authorized for the market, along with prohibition of false therapeutic claims on the product packaging. And we didn't actually begin requiring companies to demonstrate efficacy for a drug, that it actually works, until the passage of the Kefauver-Harris drug amendments in the 1960s. And there it said that, that sponsors would be required to prove through adequate and well-controlled investigations that the drug worked for its intended purpose. The FDA itself has really many roles and broad responsibilities spanning research, enforcement, education, and information generation for most food products other than meat and poultry. So that includes, vegetables and grains and the whole lot, even fish, along with human and animal drugs, therapeutic agents of biological origin, medical devices, radiation-emitting products for consumer, medical, and occupational use, food and color additives, infant formula, cosmetics, and animal feed. It actually has a very broad purview. And in fact, it oversees items accounting for about 25 cents of every dollar spent by consumers, with more than 15,000 employees and a greater than $5 billion budget. The FDA itself has estimated that it monitors the manufacture, import, transport, storage, or sale of about $1 trillion worth of products annually at a cost to taxpayers of about $3 per person, or a coffee at your local Starbucks. The FDA itself has a pretty clearly articulated mission, noting that it's responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety, efficacy, and security of all medical products for which it maintains oversight, advancing the public health by helping to speed innovations that make medicines more effective, safer, and more affordable, and helping the public get the accurate science-based information they need to use medicines and foods to maintain and improve their health. And over the years, I've operationalized that mission into this kind of schematic that I use for talks, which is they're supposed to promote timely drug approval, they're supposed to assure drug safety and efficacy, and they're supposed to encourage innovation. And much of my work has been trying to figure out are they meeting their mission? Let's start with the need for timely approval, and really this comes back this cartoon comes from the representing the FDA in the late 1980s, where it was essentially moving slowly and not making decisions in a timely way, such that people joked that it was like it had gum on its shoes. And there was a pretty widespread dissatisfaction among patients, the industry, and the FDA itself that drug approvals were simply taking too long. Companies wanted to recoup their research and development costs, and they estimated that about every month of delay was costing them $10 million in gross revenue, which is about $25 million today. The FDA acknowledged the shortcomings and argued that it needed additional staff to end its backlog of drugs awaiting approval for the market, but had not received sufficient appropriations from Congress to hire them. And this all really came to a head, as the AIDS crisis kind of exploded in the United States. This was after 8 years of President Reagan's administration, lowering the budget and essentially starving regulatory agencies of funds, not appropriating sufficient amounts to do the work. And then through the Bush years, we had the widespread growth of this disease. And here, there was so much dissatisfaction, consternation, protesting from AIDS advocacy organizations, which are really well represented in that movie Dallas Buyers Club, the sign of which I have on the lower right, to try to get the government to bring products to market, targeting the NIH and especially the FDA. And this in turn led to a sea change in how the agency was funded. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act was passed in 1992, and essentially what it did was it said that for pharmaceutical companies that were going to seek approval for their new drugs, when they submitted that application, that new drug application, they were going to be charged a fee, and it's the equivalent of about $3.5 million today. And this fee was intended to supplement, but not replace, the direct appropriations and funds from Congress. And you can see in this graph from a paper that Jerry Aborn published, well over a decade ago, you can see the amount of money that the agency received in user fees in the dark blue versus the amount appropriated by Congress. And this is specifically the money that went to the Office of New Drugs, or within CDER. And you can see that the amount that was sent to the agency through user fees actually eclipsed the amount that was appropriated by Congress by 2004. This user fee agreement was actually replicated throughout many different parts of the agency, You had the medical device user-fee agreement, you had the generic drugs user-fee agreement, you had the biosimilars user-fee agreement, all sorts of different user-fee agreements, such that the actual budget authority that comes from Congress in federal year 2020 was about 3.4 billion, whereas the amount that the agency received from industry through user fees was about 2.9 billion. So almost half of the funding that goes to the agency is for this, for these pre-market activities. And this, of course, has led to lots of criticisms of, regulatory capture, that the industry that's being regulated by the agency actually is pulling the strings and calling a lot of the shots. But what you can't deny is that the user fee acts have been exceptionally successful in terms of dropping the amount of time required for new drug applications to be reviewed. Within the first 2 years, the average amount of time that the agency required to review a new drug application went from 27 months to 14 months. And you can see every year the FDA actually posts their performance on a host of criteria that they've agreed to with industry as a part of the negotiations within the User Fee Act. And they have to meet these sort of benchmarks and standards for all the different regulatory actions they take on the approval side in a given year. So they have to approve, 90% of priority new drug application or biologic licensing applications within 6 months. And they did that for 98% of the applications last year. They have to approve the standard applications within 10 months and so on. And you can see, these performance goals are publicly posted and get a lot of attention. There is, of course, concern that as the agency begins to move faster, it leads to them making mistakes, perhaps rushing approvals forward without all of the necessary information to reassure the public about the safety of the medication. And this was a pretty seminal paper that was done in 2008 by Dan Carpenter and colleagues, where they looked at the likelihood of a subsequent safety-related problem being identified for drugs when they were approved within the last 2 months before the review deadline, as compared with drugs approved either earlier or longer after the deadline. And what they found was a nearly 5.5 times greater odds of the drug being withdrawn for a safety-related reason, and greater than 4 times odds of a black box warning, and even a greater odds of one of the dosages being discontinued, usually because of a safety problem. So you can see that the evidence for these safety concerns, is there. But this is the challenge of being the FDA. On the one side, people are always concerned you're moving too slowly or quickly, and on the other side, people are concerned you're moving too slowly. And these are just titles of opinion articles. They were written actually by the former FDA commissioner during the Trump administration, Scott Gottlieb, on papers or articles he wrote for the Wall Street Journal about the FDA essentially withholding treatments from the public. The FDA nixes a path-breaking drug for MS, and how the FDA could cost you your life. So I think many people realize that the FDA is probably doing something right when people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, are frustrated. But it was at a time when these PDUFA negotiations were coming back up that we wanted to try to get a sense of who is right in terms of is the agency moving too slow or moving too fast? Lots of people within industry and their supporters were criticizing the FDA for taking too long to approve drugs. And there had been no systematic study of, how long does it actually take for a drug to get to market in the US versus elsewhere. And, before you can de-prescribe a drug, you have to be able to prescribe a drug. And so this was a paper we did long ago now, where we looked at the regulatory review time of novel therapeutics comparing 3 regulatory agencies. Essentially, when you compare the FDA to its peers, in this case, Health Canada and the European Medicines Agency, are they moving faster or slower? And what can we learn from that? And what we did is we assembled a sample of drugs that were approved by each agency from 2001 to 2010. And there's some differences in the size of the numbers. This is in part because this was the period when the European Medicines Agency was really getting off the ground. So in some of the early years of 2001, 2, and 3, Pharmaceutical companies were sometimes getting their authorizations from one of the independent state organizations, like the equivalent of the FDA in France. And the data for Health Canada are actually only represent about half the sample, because that's when they began making their drug approval packages publicly available. But just notably, there is within our sample 72 drugs that were approved by all three regulators over this decade time period of observation. And what we found is that for all medications, is that FDA reviews and makes a decision on these new drug applications about 2 months faster than the EMA and Health Canada. And these results were consistent whether we were comparing different PDUFA periods, whether it was a drug or a biologic, the priority review status, or whether it was an orphan designation. The FDA was always faster. And actually, when we focused on that subsample of the drugs that were approved by all three agencies, what we see is that the differences were actually exacerbated. They were more substantial, as the FDA was reviewing about 3 months faster than the EMA in Canada. And one thing you might ask yourself is, well, where were the drugs coming to market first? Because perhaps the FDA is reviewing faster because it's already out, the drug has already come to market in Europe, and so that enables them to make a decision more easily. But in fact, what we find is the vast majority of drugs were first approved for the US market. So 2/3 of drugs that were approved in both the US and in Europe came to market first in the US, and 86% of drugs that came to market in both the US and Canada came to market first in the US. So the FDA is reviewing faster, and the drugs are coming to market there first. And this was consistent even when we did some follow-up studies later on, looking at different time periods, in this case from 2011 to 2015. Here it's now almost 80-day difference. So it's only growing more wide. So in terms of the FDA's mission of promoting timely drug approval, regardless of what industry has been saying, it's pretty clear that it's done a very good job of that. Whether it's too fast is a different question, one that we'll come to in a bit. But let's talk a little bit about the second major mission of the FDA, the assuring drug safety and efficacy. And this is what most of us, particularly as physicians, think about in terms of the mission of the FDA and what it's responsible for. So just as a reminder, I know I covered it quickly, but the key provision of that 1960s legislation that led to the FDA to make a determination about drug efficacy prior to the drug being market, or in order to be authorized, came in those 1962 drugs, right? It had to be demonstrated to be efficacious. That was the language that was used. And I just would note that this is a little bit of like in the eye of the beholder, kind of what efficacious means. Differs to among patients and the public, and it differs among physicians. And this was a pretty old paper where Lisa Schwartz and Stephen Woloshin did a study of the public, asking them about what's the threshold by which the FDA makes a decision to approve a drug, and that 39% of patients believe the FDA only approves "quote unquote" extremely effective drugs, and 25% that they only approve drugs without serious side effects. So, neither of these points are true, but this is the sort of public perception. Sanket Dhruva actually just published a study in Health Affairs just this month that looked at physicians' perception of these same types of issues, and found same number, actually, interestingly, 39% of physicians believe FDA only approves drugs that are more effective than alternatives. Not a true statement. Generally, the bar for approval is compared to a placebo, and 31% that only drugs that are safer than alternatives get approved. And again, this is just not true. In fact, what is required within the legislation are adequate and well-controlled investigations, which the FDA has operationalized as clinical trials that could provide "quote unquote" substantial evidence to support claims of efficacy. And what the FDA suggests, but doesn't require, is 2 or more pivotal efficacy trials, essentially 2 or more key trials to demonstrate benefit. And just to remind you, this probably is familiar way back from medical school, kind of phases of a clinical trial program as part of determining safety and effectiveness and bringing a product to market. right? You have your preclinical studies, which are non-human toxicity and pharmacodynamic studies, usually in vitro or in animals. Then you move to the clinical phase with some pharmacodynamic, pharmacokinetic testing, usually at subtherapeutic doses in healthy volunteers. Then you get to your phase 1, your dose ranging studies, where you're providing ascending doses in healthy volunteers to figure out, at what dose the drug has the physiologic effect you're looking for. And, the FDA says, this is actually information from their website, that's usually about 20 to 100 healthy volunteers are studied in this way prior to moving forward to phase 2, where now you're doing preliminary clinical testing of efficacy and safety at the therapeutic drug for patients with the disease. They say about 100 to 300 patients are studied in the phase 2 part of the trial program. And this is used to identify the estimated effect sizes in order to power and design what will be your key phase 3 or pivotal trials to your robust clinical testing of efficacy and safety, that at the therapeutic dose, thousands of patients, right? And then your drug gets approved, and then you move on to what they call phase 4, the post-market surveillance focused on safety. And I think one of the big questions is, pivotal trials, you hear a lot, again, from industry about how difficult it is to bring a product to market, the challenge with running these big clinical trial programs. And anecdotally, what we were seeing as we were sort of thinking through some of these issues is more and more drugs that seem to be coming to market after only phase 2 studies. And what we really wanted to know is, did FDA really erect a wall, making it, really so difficult that, products, couldn't get through, couldn't get, over the evidentiary standards they were requiring for approval, or what was going on. And so we set out to study this. And what we did was we looked at an 8-year period of FDA approvals, every new drug approval from 2005 to 2012. And we went through and we looked at the clinical trial evidence, that the pivotal trials that supported FDA approval. And when we did this project, it was a little bit more complicated to do than it is today. We had to go through and dig through PDFs of, medical review documents that the FDA posts after every new authorization. Lots of these documents were actually image scanned as opposed to being like searchable PDF documents. And so, I was working with a medical student and some research assistant, and it was a lot of digging in order to identify all these trials. But what we found were 184 novel therapeutics were approved over this time period for 201 indications, because some drugs, often cancer drugs, come to market with 2 indications at the first marketing authorization. And these 201 clinical indications were approved on the basis of 448 pivotal trials. And when you look at the qualities of these trials, on first glance, you think, that this is good in terms of the rigors of the evidence, the standard grade criteria for clinical trial design features. 89% of the pivotal trials were randomized, 80% were double-blinded. 87% used either an active or a placebo comparator. And just before I go on through the rest of the table, it's often, I think, really important to sort of think through the counterfactual of this, which is, these are quite likely the very best trials we will ever get in terms of demonstrating the safety and effectiveness of a drug for a specific clinical indication. It's very rare to get big trials, after approval. And so in this context, right, 11% were not randomized trials, 20% were not double-blinded, and 13% did not have a comparator arm. And, you can think about, the reasons why FDA would retain this flexibility or use a less rigorous standard. Maybe these are the rare disease drugs, maybe these are, they're very difficult to recruit patients for, but it's just worth sort of calling that out so people are thinking about it. But when you start also to look beyond those kind of, is it randomized, double-blinded, and what's the comparator, you start to realize that some of the other standards, the evidentiary standards the FDA requires, are not quite as strong, right? So what we found is about half of these pivotal trials were focused on a surrogate marker of disease, not a clinical outcome or scale. So not how a patient feels, functions, or survives, but instead a marker of that, maybe an imaging scan, maybe a serum or blood-based marker, and so it's LDL instead of whether the drug prevents a heart attack, or it's hemoglobin A1C instead of whether the drug prevents patients from developing, kidney disease from their diabetes. And then when you look at the size of the trials, it's very different than what FDA had put forward on their website in terms of the size of the clinical trial programs. What we saw is that overall, these pivotal trials on average, or the median was about 446 total patients, and that about 271 patients were assigned to the drug, right? So received the drug as part of the clinical trial. So that's very small. And the median duration of treatment was only 14 weeks. When we aggregate these trials at the indication level, we also gain some additional insights. So first, I'll show you, the median number of pivotal trials that supported an approval was 2, right? Which is, that fits with the regulatory guidance of 2 or more adequate, well-controlled investigations. But a third were approved on the basis of a single pivotal trial. So we never got even a second trial demonstrating that the drug worked. Like we found in the first one. And we often see sort of discordant evidence between these 2 pivotal trials. And so it raises the question of how certain we are of the benefit. When you look at the median number of trials, you'll see that drugs indicated for the treatment of cancer were far more likely to be approved on the basis of a single and a small pivotal trial, whereas drugs for the treatment of cardiovascular disease were often approved on the basis of multiple larger pivotal trials. So the median was 3 trials, and the number of total patients in the intervention group across all the trials that supported the approval was almost 2,300. So that looks much more like what that FDA chart showed, but you can see that that was the exception. When you look at the average duration, we see that a third of the indications approved were done so on the basis of at least 1 trial of 6 months or longer. So most of these are very, approved on the basis of short pivotal trials. And you would appropriately say, well, not all drugs are used for a long period of time. But even when we break it down by the expected length of treatment, so we essentially categorize treatments as acute use, intermediate use, like treatment for a year or so, like an oncology therapy, or chronic use, some therapy you would expect a patient to take for the rest of their life. What we found is that only 44% of drugs that were indicated for chronic treatment were approved on the basis of at least 1 pivotal trial of 6 months or longer. Only 12% on one that was 12 months or longer. So even for these chronic disease treatments, we get very short duration trials. When you look at the comparators, you see that only 40% were approved on the basis of at least 1 pivotal trial using an active comparator, and 45% were approved exclusively on the basis of pivotal trials using surrogate endpoints. And again, this was far more common among drugs for the treatment of cancer, as well as cardiovascular disease and diabetes and whatnot. And this was, again, we did the study, we looked at approvals from 2005 to 2012, but there has been an increased attention to the special FDA regulatory pathways that Congress has established, and trying to understand what its implications are for regulatory approvals. And some of these have different differential effects. So the one that most people are familiar with is the accelerated approval program. That's for indications that treat for serious conditions with an unmet medical need. This was established in 1992 and allows pivotal trials that are approval exclusively on the basis of surrogate endpoints. Other regulatory pathways like priority review, those require the FDA to make their decision more quickly, a goal of 6 months for review. The fast track program, which came about in 1997, it really it allows for more frequent interactions with the FDA and possibly, depending on who you ask, approval on the basis of a single pivotal trial. And the most recent, newest pathway is the breakthrough therapy designation, which is kind of like an amalgamation of all of these put together: more frequent interactions, guidance during development, approval on the basis of surrogate endpoints if they want, all sorts of stuff. And we looked at, well, what does this mean in terms of, standards, how standards are changing? And we looked over a 3-decade period from 1995 to 2017, with 3 years within each of those 3 decades, to try to understand, well, what is actually happening in terms of the use of these special regulatory programs? And what we found was that, way back when in 1995 to 97, about a third of new indication approvals, or the first indication approvals, received some special regulatory program designation. Whereas in the most recent period we examined, 2015 to 2017, it was up to 2/3. So it's like, now we're kind of in the Lake Wobegon where, every approval that's coming to the FDA is special. And this has had really important implications for the evidence that supports approval. So now approvals are more likely to be based on a single pivotal trial. It increased from 95 to the most recent period from 25% to 62%. The percent of pivotal trials that were randomized, double-blind, and used a comparator declined. The study size and duration were about the same, but the proportion that were exclusively focused on surrogate markers for their efficacy endpoints increased. And that's only kind of part of the problem. I think one of the other major issues is like who is the evidence representative of? And as the people on this call are very well aware, more than 90% of patients that are 60 and over are taking at least one prescription drug, and it's about 50% for patients aged 20 to 59. And this, when you start to look at, who's taking 5 or more prescription drugs, it's like about a third in the US of people aged 60 to 79. So most medications are prescribed to these, to older adults. But when you look at the pivotal trials, and this data is now pretty old, but when you look at the enrollment of patients who are age 65 and older in those trials, we could determine this data when we were looking at the 2011 to 2013 approvals for about 2/3 of approvals. And what we found then was about 60% of those approvals had 30% were approved on the basis of samples that where people over the age of 65 were 30% or less of the sample, right? So even though people that are 65 and up are taking most of the prescription medications, they're disproportionately not represented in the trials that support their approval. So what do these evidentiary standards mean for patients and clinicians? And I think this is where I try to bring this talk each time when I'm giving it to clinicians, right? Because what we want is when the FDA to approve a product, we want to be able to say to patients, look, we understand, the challenges you're facing in managing this disease. There's a medication that we have that we believe is going to have this effect. It's based on rigorous data. It's based on you focusing on these endpoints, which we think are important to you. We want to essentially lay out a path to be able to say, if you take this work, if we think you're going to get to the top of this hike, safely, cleanly, and you're going to feel better once you get there. But instead, what I worry is as these evidentiary standards kind of get further and further weakened, is that we're putting patients much more in this position, right? Where we know very little, kind of like where along the road, these drugs are going to take patients. Is it going to improve your outcomes? Well, we're not really sure. It may, right? But we don't really know because it was approved on the basis of one small trial. It hasn't really been used widely. It hasn't been tested rigorously. And it just really diminishes our confidence and our certainty in how we are able to advise our patients. This is unfortunately, not a new problem. And it's actually the challenge of addressing this problem in part comes from the way our society works, right? People want access to drugs kind of as quickly as possible, and some pretty smart people got together a decade ago and started to think about, well, what can we do to do this better, right? How can we essentially adopt what they propose to be a life cycle approach for evaluation? So we recognize that products are increasingly being approved on the basis of less rigorous evidence. Well, what can we do to increase our certainty later on? And I'll just say, we have studied this issue. So in terms of whether the life cycle approach is kind of up and running, I would say that the short answer is we're not getting data in the post-market period. This is a study that we did where we looked at any post-approval study by any organization, not just by industry, could have been done by independent investigators or people funded by the NIH, where we looked essentially at that sample of drugs that I presented before from new drug approvals from 2005 to 2012. We looked at all of those indications that were approved on the basis of either a single pivotal trials that use surrogate markers of disease, or both, right? And so there were 120 indications in our sample here. And what we found when we did essentially a systematic review of each one of these drugs for the same clinical indication, we found that over a third, we could find no subsequent trials after approval for this drug for the same clinical indication. The median number of studies that we found and patients enrolled was quite small. For the approvals that were done on the basis of a single pivotal trial, we found on average one additional study published in the literature of 90 patients. And for those that were approved on the basis of pivotal trials that focused on surrogate markers only, we found 3 trials of about 500 patients. But when we restricted the sample and looked really closely, we found that only 8% of these 123 indications had at least one or more randomized, double-blinded, controlled trial that was published after the approval of the original indication that was focused on clinical outcomes as opposed to surrogate markers, and demonstrated that the drug worked better, superior than the control arm, had superior efficacy. So we're this life cycle approach is not generating evidence to give us the confidence and certainty when we're prescribing these drugs. We've looked also explicitly at the studies that are required by FDA. These are something called post-marketing requirements. We looked at a 4-year sample of approvals from 2009 to 2012. There were more than 400 of these requirements for 106 approvals over this time. Only a third of which, though, were clinical studies. Lots of post-marketing requirements or other, animal studies or other pharmacodynamic studies. And then we looked at, these clinical studies, these 134, and found that only half of them had been completed. And almost all of those that were completed late, after the deadline specified by the FDA. And even when they were completed, only 3/4 published or reported the results in a way that would communicate this information to the public and to patients and to clinicians. And you can see just how long it takes for this evidence, these requirements that the FDA essentially says, we're going to approve your drug, but this clinical, there's some important clinical uncertainty. We're going to require you to do this clinical study. And fewer than 20% of these requirements were completed even within 5 years after FDA approval. So it just takes a substantially long time for us to get this, additional evidence that, that's needed to resolve these uncertainties. So coming back to these mission statements, does the FDA promote timely drug approval? Yes, it does, but does it assure drug safety and efficacy? Well, I've really only focused on efficacy here, and I think it kind of really depends on how you view this. I give it a big question mark. But when we think about safety, this is actually a completely different issue, right? So, when we did a study trying to actually, in part, replicate that original paper that Dan Carpenter did that looked at the sort of near deadline regulatory approvals and sort of what happened in terms of post-market safety events. And we looked at, among a sample of drugs approved from 2001 to 2010, what actions did the FDA take that indicated they had a safety concern post-market. And we looked at these at 3 different types of actions, similar to what Dan had done. We looked at withdrawals due to safety concerns, and we pulled these from a public index of FDA's post-marketing announcements. There's actually not a single page on which every withdrawal that the FDA has required is announced and kept in perpetuity. We looked at the FDA's issuance of a new black box warning. We know about somewhere it's imprecise, but 5 to 10% of products come to market with some type of a big black box warning, which you can see on the prescribing label, a major announcement that there's a concern. And there's actually no database of when FDA issues a new warning or which drugs have warnings. And so what we actually had to do was a side-by-side comparison of the first and most recent or last drug labels to see whether a new black box warning was put on a drug. And then we also looked at whether the FDA issued a safety communication. And from here, actually, there is a public index of these, post-market announcements, what we formerly called Dear Doctor letters. Now they're Dear Doctor emails. Here is an example of one, FDA drug safety communication. FDA warns about next day impairment with a sleep aid, right? And so these are what safety communications look like. And this is what our major findings were overall. We found that there were about 120 some odd safety actions for these drugs that were approved over the 10-year period. And it affected about a third of the approvals. So that's a lot. Over time, about a third of drugs get a major new, safety concern is raised and then proclaimed by the FDA to make people aware of it. Most of them are box warnings or letters. There were only 3 withdrawals. But the median time from approval to this first action is about 4 years. So if you compare the time, it took for, the evidence to be generated or to satisfy the post-marketing requirements, usually around efficacy, and here's the, the information on safety, you can see, 4 or 5 years later, we're only just beginning to understand get a more complete picture of drug safety and efficacy. And that's, led some people to sort of, this funny cartoon, like, here's a bottle with an FDA-approved drug, and, here's the safety warning, and it contains an FDA-approved drug. So assuring drug safety and efficacy, that's the question. I have some slides on innovation, but I think for purposes of this conversation, which we're much more interested in deprescribing and how, the evidence that can inform those decisions, I'm going to stop. Just make sure there's nothing here that's important. I'll just sum up by saying, the FDA plays a key role in assuring drug safety and efficacy, and by several measures. FDA is successfully promoting timely drug approval. And if I'd shown you, you would see that in some ways are encouraging innovation. But there are real important consequences for public health and safety deserve scrutiny. And I think this is really where I hope our conversation goes. What do these flexible approval standards mean for you as a clinician, both around the decision to prescribe along with the decision to deprescribe, right? In terms of whether we have the evidence really available to inform, work with patients to guide them in terms of, what drugs are best for them and what we can do better to help inform decision making. So thank you for inviting me, and I'll stop here, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. Great presentation, really fascinating and such an important angle. I just wanted to say that now is the time for question and answer. So attendees can enter them into the Q&A bubble or in the chat, and I'll curate the questions. So looks like we have one coming in. So question, what kind of regulatory pathways might be available to get deprescribing guidance included on product labels or other places?
Thanks, Mike. I'm not sure that we would ever get deprescribing on a product label for a handful of reasons. One is that FDA is very explicit in their sort of their authorities that they do not regulate the practice of medicine; they regulate the medicines. And so, while they have the authority to make sponsors, provide clinical information to demonstrate safety or demonstrate that the drug works for the approved indication, once it's available for use, the horse is out of the proverbial barn. Physicians can prescribe a drug for any purpose that they deem to be appropriate. The only thing that can hold a physician to account for their prescribing patterns is essentially, quote unquote, like a jury of their peers, through like the state medical boards. And so, whether, the ideas around sort of appropriate prescribing or inappropriate prescribing, the need for deprescribing, or, the FDA plays, has no role on it. And the second reason why this kind of information would never go onto the drug label is because actually the drug labels are managed and actually, quote unquote, owned by it's information that is that's derived from the sponsor. So I find it hard to believe that most sponsors would want to be in the business of telling people when not to use their products. Although I suppose that's probably true. They do obviously include information on patients and indications that aren't suitable for use, or patients who might be more likely to experience harm, like when it says on a warning on a drug label not to be used for patients with kidney disease or severe liver disease or whatever it is. But I think that we as a profession, if we care about when is appropriate prescribing and when patients should be deprescribed, I think it has to come more through professional guidances as opposed to from the FDA and product labels.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer. I just chime in verbally because I realized I didn't ask my question very clearly. I guess my question.
You let me go on and on.
Yeah. Not about if you should prescribe, but if the physician or clinician makes a decision to deprescribe, what are like appropriate tapering regimens or other things like that would be sort of equivalent to the recommendations on a label about what's the appropriate dose range, what's an appropriate starting dose, and so kind of the converse of that, more of like the tapering considerations.
That is a great question. And I'm sure all of you have run into this. I've run into it particularly around psychiatric meds. Like you want to take somebody off, there's such massive differences in practice patterns. You'll talk to someone who'll be like, oh, I go 1 milligram down, but a week at a time. And then you talk to somebody in psychiatry and they're like, oh, we just stop it. It's not so bad. Patient might get a little bit of a headache, but they'll be fine. I don't know that I've ever seen kind of a tapering. And when it would be, I guess if you were going to see it in a product label, it would have to be like, that's part of the indication for use, that you ramp it up, you use it for a period, and then you stop using it. A good example of that might be like Wellbutrin for bupropion for tobacco cessation. We know that that's not a medication that needs to be used forever, but they just the indication is you start people at 150 milligrams over a few days, and then you make it BID, right? But they don't say how to then taper it. And I'm sure there's probably some guidance on how to do it best. But yeah, Mike, I'm rambling because I don't have a good answer to your question, but it's pretty interesting.
Okay, some questions in the Q&A. Would you know if the FDA considers how easy it is to deprescribe for a drug when testing it? I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can interpret that question.
I guess maybe the question is how, if it's likely that a drug will be started and then stopped in terms of when it's evaluating.
Yeah, how easy or yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. I mean, FDA does work with sponsors and sort of thinking through how the drug is likely to be used. That will often inform kind of how the safety studies are required post-market. But I don't know if I've ever seen it as it relates to deprescribing.
I guess maybe my interpretation of the question would be like, I'm thinking of a drug like semaglutide, like you need to start it for obesity, but like, can you ever really stop it? Or concerns about deprescribing antidepressants for people who feel like once they're on them, it's just really hard to stop them. Not just because of return of original depressive symptoms, because of like brain zaps and all that kind of thing. At least that's what I interpret it.
Well, this makes me think that somebody should write a thoughtful editorial about this, because I don't think FDA really takes this into consideration. And semaglutide is just the most recent example, right? So you start a drug, if it's ineffective, how long do you persist in its use? If it's effective, how long do you persist in its use? Do you really? I mean, and the companies are doing some of the studies around this, but I actually think this becomes especially important in where we see marginal or modest effects, like in hypertension or in depression and anxiety management, right? We often start drugs and we're not really sure if they're working, and then we add on a second drug, right? And like, should there be much more explicit, like, well, start drug A, if that's not working, discontinue it, move to drug B. I can think of some examples of some trials that were funded by the NIH, like the Katie trial, that tried to do this a little bit more overtly, but it's certainly not something that we see as part of the standard FDA approval process. And I think this is the challenge. This is in part what maybe you guys all know it intuitively, but the requirements for FDA approval are very different than the evidence that we often want to inform our decisions about what to do with our patients, right? And we're sort of left in this tricky situation that I hear about quite often. Pharmaceutical companies will say, well, we do studies and design them like this because this is what the FDA requires. And it's not like physicians are saying, oh, we're not going to prescribe it unless you do this. They kind of just make do with the best evidence that they have available. And when you talk to folks at NIH, they say, well, we're not going to run these big drug trials because that's the responsibility of the industry, right? And even PCORI, often doesn't do these kind of comparative effectiveness, actual clinical trials, right? And so we are left with a very big evidentiary gap where maybe a product works for the indication it's been approved for, but we only know it from pretty limited evidence. And the way that it's been tested is very different than we're using it. It's not tested in older adults. It's not tested in people with multiple comorbidities, right? It's not tested in people with who are taking multiple different medications, or to look at what how it works as a second line agent as opposed to a first line agent, right? So this is how our hands are tied.
This is kind of the same theme. I guess this is about safety in deprescribing. Can you comment on the process of generating data for adverse drug withdrawal events, adverse events related to, withdrawing medications? Is this required to be monitored by trials that go before the FDA? Could it be those kind of questions?
Yeah. But the standards for safety and adverse event reporting are very different pre-market and post-market. So when a new drug is being tested as part of a clinical trial program, every adverse event is collected, interrogated, investigated by the company, reported to the FDA. And it's they're very closely scrutinized, and that's in part what leads to what adverse events end up on a drug label when a product is approved. And it's sort of like, well, what happened in the clinical trial testing program? Once a product is approved, though, we're in the post-market phase, and it's kind of like all bets are off. For the longest time, the only way FDA collected information about safety was either to require another clinical trial, which was very uncommon, that was focused on safety, or through the voluntary passive adverse event reporting system called FAERS. Many, if not all of you, have observed an adverse event from a drug in practice, and I'm sure none of you have actually reported that adverse event through the FDA's reporting system, right? And that's because we're not required to. Sponsors are required to when they are made aware of it, but we know that reporting is uneven, and so we end up with this very sort of tip of the iceberg, like safety problems without a denominator, where you just know, like, well, 3 people were reported as experiencing this, an anaphylactic reaction when they took semaglutide. That's not true. I'm just making it up, right? Now, FDA has invested in a lot of money in what's called the Sentinel system. It's like a post-market and active surveillance system for as infrastructure, essentially using claims data from a huge number of health systems and like the VA and Kaiser Permanente and whatnot, using claims data to look at safety problems. And that's better than adverse event reporting, but still pretty imperfect. And so it often takes quite a bit of time before a safety problem is identified and made certain about.
Great. And then there's one more question about getting older patients enrolled in clinical trials. Do you have any insights about that, and how can we do that better?
Yeah, there's actually quite a lot of attention at FDA over the past, I would say, 4 or 5 years on not just age representation, but diversity and representation in clinical trials, and enrolling adults from minoritized groups, older adults, making sure that the patients who are enrolled in the clinical trials are more representative of the patients with disease. And so we're sort of waiting to see kind of, how these efforts have played out. We've done a little bit of work in this space, and it seems to suggest that despite a number of kind of, putting their foot on the ground, making an announcement, talking about why this is so important, talking to companies about why they have to do it, companies saying how important it is to them, we're seeing very little changes in the sort of the demographics among individuals who've enrolled in clinical trials. And I think the part of the big challenge is like, even though, there's a lot of noise about this right now, it's at the same time that clinical trials are increasingly moving abroad, away from the US. And even when they are here in the US, they're often concentrated among, a few kind of notable academic medical centers. And so, the onus is really on us to do a better job of making clinical trials available to our patients, but we have a long way to go.
Great. Well, thank you. We're at the top of the hour and wanted to thank you again for your presentation, your flexibility. Thanks for all of our attendees. The recording for this webinar, if you know somebody who missed it, will be posted on the US Prescribing Research Network website. You will also get a evaluation survey for this webinar emailed to you. We do have another webinar coming up scheduled. Please look at the USDEN website for that upcoming event. And thanks again, Dr. Ross. Enjoyed having you, and have everybody have a good day.
Thanks,
Really
Ken. See
appreciate
you.
it.
Bye.